I was actually going to make video on where I think the next destination for the war cheerleaders would be. Also, it would have been better first to make a video about how the Ukrainian Nazi collaborators who survived World War II somehow found the loophole in the Canadian immigration system and came to Canada, only to carry on their business as usual on this side of the Atlantic. But just heard that a serpent came above the surface to fuck us Canadians over once again, so change of plan. Time is of the essence here, I suppose? You know what they say, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Same goes for Canada's two most unwanted. The not-so-honourable Christia Alexandra Freeland, Deputy Führer, and the Minister of Spend Like There's No Tomorrow, who proudly identifies herself as, quote-unquote, Ukrainian Canadian, is of Ukrainian Nazi collaborator heritage. Mikhailo Komiak, a lawyer by profession who worked as an editor for a Nazi newspaper, was Freeland's maternal grandfather. Born in Stroniatin, Galicia under the Austro-Hungarian rule in 1905, Mikhailo Komiak studied law and political studies at Lviv University. He began his journalism career in 1931. When Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union both invaded Poland in 1939, Komiak fled to Nazi-occupied Krakow and found work as an editor for the pro-Nazi Ukrainian newspaper, Krakivsky Visti. Typically, Nazis preferred keeping a tight rein on newspaper presses in occupied territories, only allowing their own limited companies to publish pro-Nazi materials. However, Ukrainians who welcomed the Nazis with open arms wanted to get more involved in the works of the New Order, a Nazi metaphor for the political system they installed in the occupied territories. Ukrainians in Krakow first sent a delegate led by Volodymyr Kubiovich, a geographer by profession, to the Nazi Governor-General of Poland and Hitler's lawyer, Hans Frank. They wanted his permission to seize what's left of the Jewish printing press, Nowy Dziennik. With Frank's blessing, the people of Krakivsky Visti, under Kubiovich's leadership, began pumping out Nazi propaganda. Which also means Ukrainians in Krakow had deliberately collaborated with the Nazis in founding, publishing, and then distributing pro-Nazi propaganda newspaper. Also, Kubiovich brazenly asked the Nazis to share the loots gathered from the Holocaust victims with him and his tribe. From the Ukrainian standpoint, collaborating with the Nazis was preferable because, unlike their Polish counterparts, they could at least publish newspapers in their own language. It also served as a life support for Ukrainian intellectuals and Ukrainian cultural life throughout the war. Nevertheless, Krakivsky Visti stands as one of many scarlet letters in Ukrainian history because it's an indisputable proof that Ukrainians had voluntarily become the cogs in the Nazi propaganda machine, while offering Jews as sacrificial lambs whenever demanded. Komiak was placed in Blonhofen displaced persons camp after the war until he and his family came to Canada in 1948. After working as a laborer for some time, he got a lab assistant position at Sherritt Gordon Mines in Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta, and worked there until retirement. But, like many of his former colleagues and their nationalist friends, Komiak couldn't let go of his old habit. He was involved in the Ukrainian War Veterans Association in Edmonton, an organization that played a quote-unquote key role in erecting the Nazi collaborator monuments in the city. He also was deeply involved in the Ukrainian diaspora education. He continued his journalistic works for Ukrainian press and published scholarly articles as well. When Komiak died in 1984, his family found a pile of documents and old newspapers, proving that he had worked for a pro-Nazi newspaper. Thankfully, we know of Komiak's involvement in Krakivsky Visti thanks to Dr. John Paul Himka, the University of Alberta history professor emeritus and his son-in-law, and Freeland, who helped her uncle as his research assistant. Generally, there are 3 ways to deal with inconvenient truths. 1. Deny it and say it's all Russian propaganda.
The entire country, you got our buddy over there.
Yeah, but how did I mess up this country?
Can anybody afford a home? In this day, they're charging people carbon tax. You got 9 V8s here idling for 30 minutes. Your carbon footprint is increasing. We're getting charged for what?
You know what we're doing?
It's not stopping. No
We're putting a price on pollution,
right?
And we're returning it to families like
I don't
yours.
think so. You're sending it over to Ukraine, right?
No.
Yeah. You send it over to the guy that you were with that slaughtered his own country.
You've been listening to Putin, have you?
Putin? No. Definitely don't listen to.
2. Sweep it under the rug, pretend that it never happened, and maintain silence. And 3. Admit it and openly express guilt and shame. Let's revisit Hans Frank, the Nazi governor-general of occupied Poland, who ruled the occupied areas under his reign like a greedy medieval tyrant. Long story short, he was hanged at Nuremberg in 1946, along with other senior Nazi officials. His youngest son, Nicholas, and his decades of work to expose his father's crime are worth mentioning. When Canadian media interviewed him in November 2017, he openly said his father was a coward, and his main interest was pleasing Hitler. He stresses that his father knew, quote-unquote, what was right and wrong, and he decided voluntarily to be on the bad side, just to be near Hitler. He also pointed out that his father knew what was going on, and knew everything. What's truly impressive about Nicholas is that he has been warning about his fellow Germans to others, claiming that a lot of his people still haven't given up the dangerous ambitions and ideas that the Hitler generation had left behind. As for Canada's deputy führer, she chose option 1 and has been sticking to her gun ever since. Komiak's history came into the spotlight almost immediately after she was appointed the Foreign Affairs Minister in January 2017. In response, she and her fans raised the Russian propaganda shield. Freeland being Freeland, she has neither acknowledged nor apologized for her grandfather's collaboration with the Nazis. In her 2015 essay titled My Ukraine, she only described her grandparents as, quote-unquote, political exiles with a responsibility to keep alive in the idea of an independent Ukraine. But as mentioned, she knew well of her grandfather's past. In his article criticizing Freeland's outright denial of Komiak's Nazi history, Robert Fife highlights, Miss Freeland, who has paid tribute to her maternal grandparents in articles and books, helped edit a scholarly article in the Journal of Ukrainian Studies in 1996 that reveled her grandfather, Michael Komiak, was a Nazi propagandist. Ideally, her career as a mediocre journalist turned crooked politician should have ended the day the truth about Komiak came above the surface in 2017. But it has been 7 years since she has been a cabinet minister, and 5 years since her knight in shiny armor, the Disney Prince from Hell, upgraded her status as Canada's second-in-command. In other words, Canadians have allowed by far the most dishonest and insincere individual in Canadian history to hold one of the most prestigious positions in the government for this long. Unlike Nicholas, she can't even acknowledge a single truth, a truth that she had found out together with her uncle. Now the question is, what does Freeland make us? Been seeing a lot of finger-pointing going on. Many of us say it's all their fault. She and her Disney prince don't represent who we are. But does it really matter? More importantly, do finger-pointing and blaming everything on them help us by any means? At the end of the day, it's us who have been suffering from the consequences of having them run the show as they please. My competitors have been saying that it's all Justin and Christia's fault, and a savior is waiting for us at the end of the tunnel, only if you would kindly sign petitions, send them money, and buy one of their merchandise. But the voice of reason, more importantly, an open admission of guilt and shame, is a rarity among Canadians. Canada's problem is not only caucustocracy, a government of the worst kind of people. After all these years, too many of us are still refusing to acknowledge that the people who run the show in Canada today are in many ways the spitting image of who we are as people. And if you ask me, Christia Alexandra Freeland is the most hyphenated Canadian person ever. Now, allow me to share a quote from Samuel Smiles' Self-Help. In sum, it's folly to expect change from people who don't want change or expect change to come out of the blue if we truly desire change and, more importantly, an honest and sane government. Because change for the better can only come from within ourselves.